Hello, and welcome to the Get a Quick Education Marketplace Risk Screening Tools and Considerations webcast. My name is Raina, and I will be your operator for today's call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. If the slides do not appear to be advancing as they should, please refresh your screen, as it may be an issue with your connectivity. I will now turn the call over to Shari Hubbard. Shari, you may begin.
Thank you, and hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar. First Advantage is very pleased to have Pamela Devada of Seyfarth Shaw and Jeremy Gottschalk of Marketplace Risk with us today. They are leading experts in risk screening tools, so we are thankful for their time. And as such, SHRM and HRCI has approved this course for one continuing education credit hour. But to receive that, I'll need you to stay logged in to the webinar for the entire presentation. We will be answering questions at the end of the webinar, so you can go ahead and submit those as they come to mind in your Q&A tab, and we will get to those at the end. In addition, there's a PDF of the slides in your resources, and at the very end of the webinar, there will be a link to complete a survey to give us some feedback on what you would like to see in the future on these kinds of webinars. So at this time, we'd like to turn the time over to Jeremy.
Thank you, Shari. As Shari mentioned, my name is Jeremy Gottschalk. I am the founder of Marketplace Risk. We built this platform as really a platform to educate, network, and share information among marketplace startups, specifically after a 15-year career practicing law and realizing there aren't a ton of resources for startups, and particularly marketplaces in the risk management, trust and safety, legal strategy space. So happy to be here, Shari.
Thanks, Jeremy. This is Pam Devada, and I'm a partner with Seyfarth Shaw. Thrilled to be here with First Advantage and with Jeremy with Marketplace Risk. I've been practicing in the area of specifically employment law with an emphasis on the Fair Credit Reporting Act and all things related to hiring considerations, both in the traditional employment realm as well as the marketplace and on-demand economy space. I've known Jeremy for many years and have worked together with him in his prior career and now with Marketplace Risk. So we're thrilled to be here today to talk a little bit about some of the risk screening tools, things that you should be considering. Before we get started, though, have to give our legal disclaimer. Though Jeremy and I are both lawyers, we are not giving any legal advice or counsel today, and obviously you should understand that Seyfarth Shaw, Marketplace Risk, and First Advantage, no one who is speaking today is giving any legal advice or counsel whatsoever, and the information is for informational purposes only. To the extent that you do have questions at the end, as Shari mentioned, we will be trying to answer as many of those as possible in our allotted time, but please understand we are not giving legal advice or counsel, and to the extent there is a factual scenario, we'll likely not be able to answer factually specific questions. But do use the tab in the bottom of your browser to ask any questions, and we will try and get to those at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it back over to Jeremy to talk a little bit about our agenda, what we're going to be covering today, and what our purpose is.
Thanks, Pam. Today, our purpose is to cover risks associated with marketplaces, and more specifically, risk mitigation screening tools and considerations for marketplaces when you're leveraging these tools. As most people on the webinar know, that every business has risk simply by starting your site, turning on your mobile app, or in the bricks and mortar sense, opening your doors. In the case of these virtual marketplaces, though, the risk begins when your app or your website goes live and you allow both sides of the marketplace to connect with one another, communicate, and ultimately transact. Unlike other businesses, though, marketplaces facilitate the online and, in many cases, the offline interaction of two, in some cases, three complete strangers. So along with the offline in-person interaction and transactions comes a whole new set of risks which marketplaces try to mitigate through screening.
And obviously the goal of any screening when we're talking about these is really to weed out those users that have certain qualities or characteristics or criminal histories or something else in their past that could potentially cause risk to users of the platform. That may be your customers, it may be your property, it may be the brand image of your specific marketplace, or otherwise would make them undesirable as marketplace participants on either side of that three-way triangle that Jeremy was talking about. And in this webinar, as you can see from the agenda, we're really trying to drill down on some of the most common screening tools that we see in our practices and that we've seen over a number of years that are leveraged by these on-demand and marketplace companies, and frankly, what you should be considering when you're evaluating the use of them. Some of the tools many people know about, but many people don't.
Absolutely. And so we're going to start with digital identity, run through background checks, sex offender registries, social media screens, search engines, and then some other tools and services. But to kick this off, as I tell people and work with startups, the one thing that I start with always is knowing your customer and leveraging digital identity tools to know who you're dealing with. And that's on both sides, or in the case of a three-sided marketplace, all three sides. And you get to know your customer the easiest way through digital identity tools. These tools will use either data points provided by the users themselves. So it could include name, date of birth, email, phone, their physical address, or biometrics or identification comparison, selfie comparison, links to other accounts, and even other data points. The digital identity tools also will look at data points tied to the user's device. So it could be an IP address, it could be geolocation information, or some sort of a stamp that is put on the device to know that that user is the same user that's registered when they come back.
And when you're dealing with these digital identity tools, some of the considerations that you really want to look at it really depends on the use case that you are using the data for. So, for example, it may be that these digital identity tools are used as a gateway so that an individual can register, for example, to be a part of a platform or to use an app. You have to be careful because obviously you may want to have some sort of backup to deal with those types of issues that we generally see in employment law. For example, ADA accommodations or public accommodations under Title III of the ADA that doesn't deal with specifically employment, but that deals more generally with the public. The other type of consideration is to look at, are you looking at this for access to that marketplace or to a specific system or service, or are you using this digital identity for purposes of some deeper eligibility purpose? And the reason why that matters is because there may be some other implications, like, for example, and you'll hear us talk about this a lot, the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act and or other state law analogs that talk about when, for example, use of tools by a third party specifically implicate someone's character, general reputation, personal characteristics, mode of living, or credit. And the Fair Credit Reporting Act is a law that has been implicated back since 1970. It has a terrible name. It's absolutely not only dealing with credit checks. It deals with a large variety of other tools and other screening methodologies when a third party is used. And the concern is that while digital identity tools can be really, really excellent, useful tools, you have to be careful if you are using them specifically for an eligibility purpose in it and using a third party to determine whether or not someone is who they say they are because of the accuracy implications, right? Obviously, certain information can be manipulated very easily. and it is challenging to determine if a person who is providing information really is that person, which is frankly the reason why you're using the tool in the first place, right? So you need to be careful about the data that is being utilized and understand that there may be some implications about using that data depending on the purpose you're using it for, and specifically with the FCRA implications. Of course, someone can manipulate data, ID data, selfie data, the information that an identity thief can take, for example. And so accuracy is going to be paramount. So those are some considerations you need to determine when you're evaluating the type of digital identity tool that you might be using, and then the use case as well.
Yeah, that's right. And the one thing that I want to drive home that Pam just said is, the goal with this tool is to screen out fake users, stolen identities, et cetera, really to know who the customer is. But many of these systems can be gamed and subverted. And so you really want to make sure, in addition to a digital identity tool, that you use other tools that would confirm the identity beyond the information that's submitted by the user, as well as the information or the data points that are tied to that user. Okay, so we're going to move on to background checks. Background checks are great tools to uncover past criminal convictions. There are several types or variations of background checks, and really the benefit of using criminal conviction information is because there's this notion that if somebody has committed crimes, that they're likely to commit more crimes. You certainly want to weed out users based on known bad behavior or characteristics, violence, drugs, et cetera. So background checks can be very valuable tools to understanding your user's history and preventing any similar activity or behaviors in the future on your platform.
And obviously, background checks encompass a myriad of different types of information, right? So criminal is generally the broadest area that we see, especially marketplace companies and every employer really utilizing when they're going to be using background check information. But there's also other information that can be obtained and used when we're talking about background checks. So, for example, education history may be implicated and may be important for you to know, depending on what kind of marketplace you have. Employment history is another type of piece of information that may be important if you want to validate or verify for a specific reason. We're going to talk about sex offender registry next, but that is generally a type of background check that either you can get yourself or when you use a third party. We're going to talk in a few moments again about the third party implications. Other types of background checks would include driving records, obviously, either gotten directly from a Department of Motor Vehicles or other source, or a third party that can get that information for you. And then, of course, credit checks and that type of information. I would say much rarer in the marketplace, although depending on, again, what type of marketplace you have, certainly could be implicated. And of course, the biggest considerations that we're talking about and thinking about here with the issue of background checks is, how are you getting the information, who is getting the information, and can that information be trusted, for example, and utilized. So, for example, if you are getting the information by going directly to a court system, right? Are you reading the information correctly? Are you ensuring, for example, that the John Smith that you are searching is indeed the person who is utilizing the marketplace? Most companies, generally speaking, aren't doing their own background checks. They're usually using a trusted provider who is a known entity in the background screening space, like a consumer reporting agency. And that, of course, is a legal term of art. That is defined under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. But these are companies who their entire business is to provide accurate information in terms of gathering background screening or background check information, all of which the kind that we've talked about. And because a third party could be utilized, when a third party is utilized, there's a couple things to remember. The first is you generally utilize a third party because they have responsibilities under the Fair Credit Reporting Act to take reasonable procedures to ensure maximum possible accuracy. And so there's that accuracy component. But as a user of information, you also have very specific responsibilities under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, not the least of which are the two most, I would say, most important and most litigated, are that the individual has to provide consent for that information to be obtained, and you have to follow adverse action requirements. Depending on the purpose for which you are getting that information, and if it is deemed to be, and I'll put this in quotations, employment purposes, for example, then there are even more burdensome requirements on that consent and on that adverse action. Very, very highly regulated, very highly litigated. I've made my entire practice on defending companies, both employers and marketplace gig economy companies and consumer reporting agencies, based on the litigation and counseling on how to do this right in the industry. So you just need to understand that there are those parameters. The other thing that you need to remember is that background screening companies, consumer reporting agencies, also have limitations on what they are allowed to report to you under the law. And it's not by their choice. It's legally imposed on them. So there are certain limitations under the law where they're not allowed, for example, to provide non-conviction information, so arrest record information or even pending information that goes beyond a 7-year time frame from the date that a charge has been filed, for example, in the criminal history world. There's also state law implications, so not the federal FCRA, but like, for example, California only allows a background screening provider to go back 7 years based on convictions. There are some issues as it relates to salary or expected pay and those types of things, but they're generally not implicated in the marketplace economy. You also have the other issue of certain specific local jurisdictions and state laws that are called ban-the-box laws. And those obviously implicate brick-and-mortar employers, but they oftentimes will also implicate gig economy, on-demand marketplace companies because they are so broadly written. And the most egregious and conservative of those laws are in New York City and in LA, but there's a myriad of other jurisdictions, very much at the local level, not even at the state level, that have very specific parameters that you need to determine if you're going to be dealing with this. Obviously, background checks are regulated, highly regulated, and so there's a lot of considerations that you want to consider. The last thing on the background check piece that I do want to mention is oftentimes people think that, for example, if they just go online and use an online source, for example, that perhaps the Fair Credit Reporting Act may not be implicated or some of these other laws may not be implicated. You need to be certainly aware of the fact that if there is a third party involved, whether it is a company who is online or otherwise, there may be implications, and that really is going to be your responsibility to check on based on their terms and conditions or their terms of use or the permissible purposes that is allowable for that type of information. So you're going to really need to know what your use case is to understand if those implications are something you need to be aware of.
Yeah, and the one thing I would add here is, the goal of a background check is to identify past criminality, particularly criminal convictions. And when you run a background check once, that's information or data as of a point in time. And so a lot of background check providers will offer repeated checks that may be quarterly or semi-annually or annually that will kind of check up on the criminal history of a user on a platform or in a marketplace. And then some some background check providers also offer continuous checks that will monitor an individual and any type of criminal activity that pops up regularly. So between the repeated check, and those can be updated. Information can be provided regularly throughout the year. The one thing that I always caution people to think through is, number one, that a background check is just information as of a point of time, and so you want to leverage them more than once, because as soon as the background check is run, while it's really good information to have, that information or that background could change pretty quickly. So leveraging repeated checks and continuous checks, I think, is really important for the users of a marketplace. Then the other part of that is I think in the 80s and the 90s, people thought that a criminal conviction, would preclude somebody from participating or from applying for a job. And as Pam talked about the ban the box laws, this notion is that, not all criminals recidivate. And so there is a push with the Fair Chance Hiring initiative and a lot of data that would suggest that users that are screened out because of a criminal conviction may result in the loss of really good users or workers for marketplaces. So I think it's incredibly important to leverage background checks to understand what data is in them or what the criminal convictions pertained to, and then evaluate whether or not that really should preclude somebody from participating in your marketplace, because in many cases the recidivism rates are much lower than thought, and a lot of the formerly incarcerated or convicted would make great employees or workers, especially on marketplaces.
That's a really great point, Jeremy. And there's the practical implications, right? And then there's the legal implications, and they're really both very, very important. And so, some of those laws that Jeremy was referring to are these sort of fair chance initiatives in hiring and these ban the box laws and the EEOC criminal history guidance that was passed back in 2012. And so it really is not a situation where, for example, and you really need to be very, very careful about making it a situation where you say, someone has been convicted ever, they can't be a part of my marketplace. Now, obviously, it's going to depend on your specific type of marketplace, but understand that there's a lot of different nuances that go into that, and frankly, potentially some legal ramifications if you have a bright line rule like that.
Absolutely. We're going to move on to sex offender registries. As opposed to general court records, the sex offender registries are pretty uniform for the most part from state to state, and almost all states maintain sex offender registries. And these are registries subsequent to a conviction where the offender would need to, or would be listed, or would need to list themselves again when it pertains to some sort of sex offense. The registries tend to be pretty consistent. There are a lot of anomalies, and there are certainly variations, but they, much like background checks, they are good indicators of past conviction information and history, especially as it relates to sex offense. And it's safe to say that sex offenders are undesirable for really any platform connecting people, and so they can be really good tools when screening your users.
Absolutely. And the other piece of this is, as Jeremy mentioned, these are oftentimes it's publicly available information. And so if you are utilizing that information internally without using any sort of third party, and there are national sex offender registry websites that the Department of Justice has, the Drew Sogin NSOPW website, for example, then there are no implications of the Fair Credit Reporting Act or these other laws whatsoever. You do need to be careful when utilizing this data because, number one, you want to make sure that the information is verifiable. And what I mean by that is you do want to make sure that the person who you are screening is the same person that is on the sex offender registry. And obviously, when a third-party background screening company does that, although there's legal implications, they have a higher standard, right? They have a higher matching standard to make sure that certain personal identifiers match. For example, if you are looking at that information yourself, there may be individuals with a same name or year of birth, for example. So you do want to make sure that you're looking at that. But once you do that, then information can be tremendously useful, as Jeremy was saying. To the extent you are using a third party, the same FCRA implications that we had chatted about before would still be applicable, depending on the specific use case that you're using as well. The other couple of pieces of information with regard to sex offender registries there are state restrictions for certain use of that information. So, for example, if you are deemed to be employing individuals, and this is for an employment purpose, for example, in California and in Nevada, there are very specific prohibitions on the use of sex offender registry information when making an employment decision. Now, obviously, there's going to be some question about whether you are or are not making an employment decision depending on the type of company you are and the type of marketplace you are. There are exceptions in California when you're dealing with a person at risk. So, for example, if someone on your marketplace as a user, either a provider of services, for example, would be dealing with a vulnerable population like children or the elderly, there are absolutely, in California, there are exceptions. Now, in Nevada, there are not. And the last sort of consideration is a broader consideration of some of the same things we were talking about as it relates to criminal history, which is it related to the service, for example, that the person is going to provide? It may be very, very related if someone is on the sex offender registry because there is a heinous crime with a child and they would be interacting with children, for example. This is a very easy one, right? Versus, for example, delivering a good to a front door versus providing a service in someone's home or providing a service in someone's car or otherwise, right? Very different delineations of that. So sex offender registries, though, are a publicly available great source to utilize. You just need to understand some of the potential limitations and some of the potential risks of that accuracy piece.
Yeah, and the two things I would add to that are as I mentioned, there's usually pretty good consistency across the registries. But as a marketplace, especially when you're trying to onboard supply, you want to think through, and this goes to Pam's point, really think through false positives. So even though the information may be pretty consistent, there are a lot of John Does, for example, not to call out anyone's name in specific, but there are a lot of John Does that you'll want to confirm the other data points. And in some cases there's a photo, some cases there's a physical address, portions of a social, et cetera. So you really want to drill down, because as a marketplace that wants to acquire both supply and demand, you want to ensure that you're not including or restricting users because of false positives. And then, the other thing in terms of, false positives, because the data is not 100% consistent, you're going to want to match up the data points with other data points that you have, really to confirm that the person is, or the person identified on a sex offender registry is really the individual in question. All right, we're going to jump to social media screens. So I think everyone's aware with social media today, so I don't think we need to define it, but there are services that will screen or collect publicly available information about an individual through their social media accounts, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, et cetera. The information, provided that the user's accounts are public, the information collected can be extremely, extremely broad, anything from photos to text, content, shared articles, interests, et cetera. So the breadth of social media screens is really quite wide. And because of all of that, you get, and I guess unlike criminal convictions or criminal records, social media information can demonstrate a user's judgment, actions, attitudes, behaviors, et cetera, which is potentially more predictive of future behavior than one incident in the past that might be revealed on a background check.
That's right. And obviously, as it relates to these social media screens, you can imagine that some of the same considerations we've talked about with some of the other screening tools and research tools are also present, right? I think the difference with social media screens is that the accuracy of the information sometimes can be potentially very, very, very helpful, obviously, information if it is relating to that person, but it can be suspect. I can go on to a social media account and pretend to be someone else, and we see that, right? You see these multiple accounts for individuals that may or may not be the person. So you do want to make sure that the accuracy of that information is verifiable, and that's really difficult sometimes because anyone can pretend to be someone else. We have found, though, that there are third parties who have many, many different ways of trying to shore up that accuracy, and so sometimes that is very helpful to do. The other thing is there may be limitations on what you can look at and what you want to look at. And what do I mean by that? If you look at someone's social media, you may find protected class information or information that has nothing to do with their ability to be on the marketplace, and yet you can't unsee it, right? There's a number of states that have specific, I'll call them, legal off-duty protections. So, for example, the fact that someone smokes in general employment law, there's a number of states that you can't take action on that if they're doing it off-duty and off-premises, for example. But then again, what does premises mean when depending on what type of marketplace you have? However, social media, as Jeremy said, can be very enlightening, and you may see things that would cause you to have pause, for example. So indices of illegal activity or violence or racism or poor judgment may be able to be gleaned once you are satisfied that you have verified the accuracy of the individual as well as the accuracy of the person. But you do have to be careful because, again, none of these screening tools, to me, is determinative or definitive. You need to look at these in the context of a risk mitigation screening program, which is why Jeremy and I are here really talking about some of the most commonly used tools, and we're going to talk about a few more that are not always commonly used, but you may want to think of. You have to also take with a grain of salt the out of context, right? Is this a one-time comment that someone made that could be taken out of context, or is this indicative of someone who perhaps by having this on their social media, whether public or private, could be an indicator that it is not someone, for example, that you would want to have on the marketplace because for example, it might cause risk, again, to your customer's property, brand image, for example. So those are some of the things that you want to think about when you're using social media. Obviously, the last is if you do use a third party to get this information, again, the Fair Credit Reporting Act would be implicated. However, it may be that utilizing a third party may cause some of these other items to go away. The accuracy issue may be shored up. Seeing things that you only want to see, for example, and not other protected class information that you don't want to see could also be shored up. But those are the implications that you want to make sure that you take a look at when you're using social media. I think the one other thing I would just say is people were really very nervous about using social media. I would say probably in the last 5 or 6 years, because there were all these laws that said that you're not allowed to ask someone for their password. I've been practicing now for a number of years, and I can honestly tell you I've never seen any employer nor on-demand marketplace company ask someone for their social media password. So those laws really are much ado about nothing, I think.
Yeah, and to that point, it's really important to keep in mind that any sort of social media screen is only going to be able to kind of collect information or evaluate publicly available information. So if the accounts are private, you're going to have a very difficult time accessing any of that information, which is, again, when you're really going to want to be paying attention to false positives or people with the same name, because in fact, the person you may be trying to collect information on, their accounts may not be public, and then you may be evaluating somebody else that can not your unintended target. The other piece on this is, the technology that is used, and I want to differentiate that from background checks. With social media screens, the technology will collect images and content, potentially different other articles or links that are contained within a user's profile. And in a background check scenario, the background check will reveal, depending on the state, but in most cases it will reveal a conviction and then conviction information, provided that they can share it under law. In this case, and that's a very binary system, there's either criminal conviction or there's not a criminal conviction. In this case, it's a lot more subjective, and it's certainly not binary. So a report that you get along with some sort of a social media screen may include images. There is technology available that will evaluate the images and look for things like alcohol and drugs, et cetera. But just keep in mind that a can of beer could very easily look like a can of soda, or a bottle of beer, or a bottle of soda, et cetera. And so a picture can be misleading, and it can also throw off the best technology that's evaluating or analyzing the picture, the data, the metadata within that picture. And then the other thing to think through is, and as Pam mentioned, kind of out of context material, because you're getting a report with information or content that you may have selected as undesirable or triggering some sort of further review or warning. It's really important to dig below the surface if you're going to use this information, because, like I mentioned with a photo, even with any sort of statements or links, there is often a lot more than what you're seeing in that report. And because it's so subjective, you don't want to fall into some sort of a pitfall or kind of a legal issue by virtue of using information that may not be or photos that may not be nefarious at all. It could be it could be essentially not what it appears to be. Okay, we're gonna move ahead to search engines. So obviously, Google being the #1 search engines, a lot of marketplaces leverage search engines to search information about users, in many cases, both sides or all three sides of the marketplace. And I think it could be said that all of these tools could and should be leveraged for more than just the worker if it's a services platform, but could be used on the consumer side or the person purchasing the services, or in a three-sided marketplace, really on all three participants. And one of the ways, and perhaps one of the most cost-effective ways that marketplaces do this, is through search engines like Google and Bing. I mean, obviously they're free, so you can search for any person, any name. You can refine that search with any sort of data that you have on that person, whether it's address or cities or et cetera. And you can then dig further and then go into the rabbit hole of search engines and find out a lot of information. These are great ways to uncover information about users that potentially background checks might not uncover, including media reports and information that you wouldn't find in a background check, potentially information that you wouldn't find on your traditional social media, so Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, et cetera. There are a lot of other platforms out there that can be searched by these search engines, including Medium articles and things that, and other, I would say, social media or quasi-social media platforms that Google is able to scroll and search. So they can be very, very cost-effective. They can and provide very, very broad results and broad and I would say deep results into the background of any of your users on the marketplace.
And the thing about search engines, right, are just as Jeremy was saying, there are, I call it the no good deed goes unpunished, and we see these, again, in traditional employment situations, but we also see this in the area of marketplaces, which is you just never know what you're going to get, right? The considerations are similar to some of the other tools of the accuracy of the information, of the fact of whether it's verifiable or not, or just totally made up. Much like some other things, anybody can put anything on the internet, right? It's also issues of getting information that you don't care about, you don't want to know, and frankly, when it's in the public domain, is it now free for someone to get? I mean, and what I mean by that is obviously the cost is free, but is this something that you as a marketplace should be and wanting to know about? So it may be that there is protected activity that a person is engaged in, having to do, again, it may be something like a protected class like gender or race or national origin or sexual orientation or religion or a myriad of other things that really doesn't have any impact on their ability to be a user of the marketplace in most situations, right, if not all situations, familial status, those types of things. And the problem is once you know it, then what? Again, and give you an example, in the traditional employment aspect, right, age is always a consideration, right, with the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. And so employers are very cautious about what information they get during their evaluation of candidates, like date of birth and other dates of education, other things that could be proxy for age. Well, again, similarly, it may be that you don't want to have a situation where there is potential liability because you're using things that, frankly, you don't really care about. And sometimes it's hard to understand what you're going to get. It's like throwing a shot in the dark. Again, useful tools, but they need to be taken with understanding of the potential ramifications and also used thoughtfully. And I think that goes for every single one of the tools that we've been talking about today, is that there does need to be an air of thoughtfulness. Again, the reason why you are using these tools is to mitigate your risk. But you mitigate your risk on two ends of the spectrum, right? You mitigate your risks by protecting who gets onto the platform in the first place and then who deals with your customers and other members of the platform, for example, or other users of the platform. but you also mitigate your risk by not excluding people who very well should be and have the capability and could be excellent platform users by unnecessarily ruling people out. So both of those are considerations. I think we're going to move on to our last area, which is some of the other tools and things that you may want to think about. And certainly this is by no way, shape, or means the myriad of all the tools that are out there. These are just some of the most popular. Jeremy?
Yeah, so two of the tools that we've listed here, these are actually the providers of the tools, but ultimately they're aggregators of, in the case of Thorn, they're aggregators of telephone numbers that have been linked to prostitution, trafficking, et cetera, type websites and classified ads. And in the case of Child Rescue Coalition, they're IP addresses that have been tied to the exchange of what is known as child sexual exploitation imagery and file sharing networks specifically targeted for this type of information. And in both of these cases, these companies aggregate known phone numbers, known IP addresses of users that have been involved in this type of activity. And these databases are one-of-a-kind databases, in many cases developed with the help of law enforcement. And so the data itself is pretty good data, but as Pam will talk about, there are a lot of considerations, much like we went into before, of connecting this information with the actual user, because there's a gap between the data that is accessible and the actual user that you are trying to screen.
That's right. And, look, there's, sometimes you need to know what you're getting, right? And so certain types of these sort of database or tools don't connect a person with something. They connect a machine or they connect data. And so you have to understand that, not always where there's smoke, there's fire, but sometimes there is. Again, so it's really making sure that you are using some thoughtfulness when you're looking at the tools. The other thing that I think is really interesting about tools that utilize, IP information or sexual predator information or those types of things is that you need to understand what the tools do and perhaps some of the limitations of what the tools do. And if you're looking at the fact that this may be a indicator and then you put the puzzle together, right, okay, well, look, this person is on the sex offender registry and they show up on this tool that's matching the data algorithm of the IP address with an IP address in this geolocation of this individual, for example, and there's criminal history. Well, that gives a much broader picture than maybe one data point. I often say that in the world of risk mitigation, it's an art, not a science, right? There is not just one size fits all, which is why there's all these variety of tools, of course, that we have to look at. But you do need to make sure that, if a tool is connecting someone to a machine, a phone, or an IP address, or a computer, or a geolocation, for example, that you do understand those limitations and you drill down on that. Again, useful tools when used in the right way. That's much like, I say this often in terms of just general background screening, right? When you're looking at a national database search of a broad brush of information in a criminal background check, tremendously useful tool if used in the right way. So those are the things that you really need to make sure and take pause when you're looking at your risk mitigation. Obviously there's many, many different tools, different softwares, different companies, and other items that you want to take a look at that can potentially reduce your risk. And the key takeaway that we want to share with you, obviously, is, you need to go into it with your eyes wide open. Know what you're getting, know the reason why you're getting the information, your use case, so you know what laws may be implicated, and then understand the potential limitations of the use of that information. And a lot of these, when used together, we have found have been very successful tools in terms of reducing marketplace risk overall.
Absolutely. So that concludes the substance of our presentation. We've got some questions that I will tee up. And I think that, Pam, the first one is for you. And they ask, will the digital identity tool be considered a part of a consumer report? And if not, will CCPA provisions apply?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is, again, which we were trying to allude to, is it depends on the use case, right? So if the use case is that you are identifying someone and saying that this individual's identity, this individual cannot use the marketplace, for example, or is ineligible, and that bears on that person's, for example, eligibility purpose to provide services, depending on what kind of marketplace you may be, for example, there could be FCRA implications because it could be part of a consumer report. It also depends on who's providing the information and how they're providing it. So a lot of it has to do with both of those two things that we were talking about. Real quickly, as it relates to the CCPA, obviously, which is the California privacy protection law that have gone into effect, there are exceptions to that law as it relates to the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So, for example, if the information is being utilized for an FCRA purpose, it is accepted out of the CCPA, generally speaking. Again, that's a broad generalization, but there is an exception for that. If it is not, then you need to see if another exception applies. And if another exception does not apply, then you could have some implications.
Excellent. Next question. What advice would you give to a new startup in the gig economy or marketplace looking at where to begin with risk mitigation and screening? I will start by saying that and this is a little bit of a shameless plug, but the Marketplace Risk Management Conference, where both First Advantage and Cyfarth teams present on a lot of these topics, is a great place to start. Because we have over 50 sessions that are devoted specifically to risk management, risk mitigation for marketplaces. In terms of kind of where you're starting, when you're starting, the one thing I tell startups is thinking through these issues at the beginning will be much more efficient and helpful than when you start thinking of them after or when you start to hit scale. Because the product is already built and the technology stack, you've got to then start replacing things. So, one of the first things you're going to want to do is, one, you're going to want to consult, a lawyer, one of the PAMs of the world, to start thinking these things through, so you don't get yourself into or buy more risk. But also in terms of thinking through background checks and all these screening tools, as you're developing pre-launch, start having these conversations because it will inform how you build your registration, your user flows, and the experience on your marketplace. And once you've already built it, you can certainly add these tools or incorporate them after the fact. But you're going to have to rip and replace and make a lot of changes in many cases in order to do that. So going into developing your platform with these things in mind and having the conversations at the beginning is going to save you a lot of time in the end.
I'd echo everything you said on that, Jeremy.
The next question I have is, should I be considered about a third-party provider? Pam, I'll let you hit that one.
Yeah, I think so. The issue is, as it relates to third-party providers, the considerations that you really need to look at are, third-party providers like background screening companies are in the business of providing this information, depending on what information you're looking for. So oftentimes they will have access to lots of different tools and resources and information, and will be able to do a very, very good, high-quality job of matching the accuracy of this information. One, because that's what their business is, and two, because legally they're required to do so under the law. They also have the ability to potentially vet out things that you don't care about. Like, for example, in the social media space, if you don't care about certain things and you only want to see other things, there is that as well. And so, I would say that there are a lot of things that utilizing a third-party screening provider and partner are very, very, very good at, and you certainly want to utilize. I think the other piece of that is to understand that your screening program, as Jeremy was saying, is a program, right? And so it's not just that you do one piece of the puzzle. You want to do and look at what are the screening tools that are going to provide the most utility to you in making the best decision to mitigate your risk of who you allow on your platform and who you allow to be on your marketplace. But I do think that utilizing people in the industry who do this for a living, at least as it relates to some of the tools, can be very, very helpful because you're going to start off at a run instead of starting from scratch.
Yeah, that's right. And the one thing I would add is, I think when a lot of startups lift off, they're doing a lot of this manually. And the reality is the third-party screening providers, obviously they can do it much faster, much more efficiently, thoroughly than you can yourself. I mean, they're the experts in the industry and have access to the most amount of data. So while there may be a tendency to do a lot of these screens manually, the reality is if and when you hit scale, which is the goal, you're not going to be able to do that. And so you really want to partner with these third parties sooner rather than later, so that you can focus on building and acquiring customers. The next question we got was, and I think this will probably be our last question based on our time, but what tools do you recommend for checking buyers? This is a question that always comes up, and I think at the core of this question is when you are screening both sides of the marketplace, or like I mentioned before, there are three-sided marketplaces, but when you're considering screening users, generally speaking, on a services platform, it would be the worker. There's a cost associated with that, and I think that most marketplaces see the biggest risk with the service provider. But the reality is there's risk that associated with all sides of the marketplace, including the buyers. And it could be something if it's a platform for transacting goods. It could be fraudulent credit cards, fraudulent buyers. On a services platform, it could be a customer who has some nefarious purpose or goal in mind. And so the reality is you can certainly screen both sides of your marketplace. The question you have to think through is what that user experience is like. I think customers, buyers are not generally used to screening. I think nowadays, especially on services platforms, it's more and more common because the marketplace, I think, can be very clear about wanting to foster a safe marketplace, and that includes both sides of the marketplace. But a lot of these checks and these screens can certainly be run on all sides of the marketplace. It comes down to the user experience, but also the cost, and balancing the cost with the benefit. But the reality is there are risks that come along with all participants in a marketplace. And really, while a lot of marketplaces look at the workers on a services platform, the reality is the buyers are just as likely or able to commit the same bad act that you're trying to prevent with the workers. So I think that a good question, and you can definitely leverage these tools for all of them. And that that concludes our time here. I'm going to turn it over to Raina to finish up the call.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. At this time, a survey will appear on your screen. We appreciate your participation. This concludes today's conference. You may now disconnect.
Thanks, everyone.